Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. If everybody would just come on in and have a seat for those who's going to be participating. Okay. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you all here to UACCM. My name is Mary Newsom, and I am the assistant to the chancellor here. And today we are celebrating Women's History Month, and we have an awesome, phenomenal woman, a speaker here today that's going to give you lots of good information. So I'm also going to introduce her. And after I finish, and when she comes on and does her speaking, and then she will invite Ms. Lauren Bryan to come up, and then we'll go from there. Okay. I left my glasses, but here they are. Sorry. That happens when you get old. Okay. Adena White is an accredited public relations professional with more than a decade of experience leading communication efforts for nonprofits. She founded Blackbelt Media in 2017 to help purpose-driven organizations advance progressive social change throughout the South through strategic communication and storytelling. Blackbelt Media produces the Blackbelt Voices podcast, which propagates the richness of Black Southern culture by telling stories from and about Black folks down South. Since it launched in September 2019, the podcast has been ranked among the top 100 of Apple Podcasts and has been featured in the Oprah magazine and Vanity Fair. That's amazing. That is really awesome. A Conway County native, Adena was raised in Center Ridge and attended Arkansas Tech University in Russellville, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in speech, communication, and journalism with an emphasis in public relations. She later completed a master's degree in applied communication studies from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. In 2013, she achieved her accreditation in public relations through the Public Relations Society of America. She served on the board of directors for the Arkansas chapter of PRSA for 9 years and was elected president of the 100-member chapter in 2019, making history as the first Black person to hold this office. Adena resides in Conway, Arkansas with her husband Matthew and their 2-year-old son Elijah. Won't you please put your hands together and join me in welcoming to the stage Adena White. And she's also a relative of mine.
Thank you, Mary, cousin, something, for that great introduction. It's an honor to stand before you today and speak. I see the top halves of many familiar faces in the audience. Thanks to Mary for inviting me to speak today for the Women's History Month speaker at UACCM, and also to the committee who organized this, and to Mary Clark and the PR and marketing team for helping get the word out. As you all know now, I'm Adena White. I'm a Conway County native, hailing from Center Ridge, and I'm the founder and chief storyteller of Blackbelt Media, a company that helps purpose-driven organizations promote an equitable and more inclusive society through storytelling. So Blackbelt Media produces the Black Voices podcast, which we'll talk about later today. So during this session, I'll give you some background about Blackbelt Media, and we'll talk about the power of communication to shape who we are and to influence change. Just 1 second. There we go. Okay, so my mom was probably like, what is she doing? I know where this is. This is outside my grandma's house. She lives in Center Ridge, right next door to my parents, where I grew up. The house in the background is my parents' house where I grew up, and those are some cows, some baby cows. And my grandma's 101 years old, so like she's still around, so that's a blessing. But although my family has lived in the rural southern part of the United States for generations, it was never really something that seemed like it was for me and for other Black people. Because when we think of being Southern, people typically think of practices that pertain to the dominant culture, like country music or the rebel flag or negative stereotypes that come from our region's history of enslaving Black Americans. So this became even more clear to me during the 2016 presidential campaign and in the months following the election. So those on the right would use Chicago as a dog whistle for black, and those on the left, who lived outside of the South, they were just annoyed with middle America and the South after the election of Donald Trump, not really understanding that black Southerners who did not support Donald Trump in large numbers were part of the South too. So for me personally, I felt angry and disappointed, but I also felt inspired by all of the people after the election who had a renewed sense of purpose and justice and equity and advocating for those on the margins. So as a PR professional, I was trying to think of what I could do to make a difference. So in April 2017, I decided to launch a media company that would share the stories of black Southerners from all walks of life, both rural and urban, and just all throughout the South. So that's when Blackbelt was born. So the idea went through several iterations. It went from a print magazine, which I was like, no one really reads that, it's a lot of work, to a newsletter, to a blog. And I wrote the first story for the blog, and then the woman I was talking to, she's from Little Rock, and she lives in Nashville now, and she started crying, talking about the impact her mom had on her life. And I was thinking, like, man, this would be a good audio podcast, but I'm not a talker, so I'll just file that away. But then I told several people about the idea, including a friend of mine named Kara Wilkins, and she was on board to help write for the blog. And then we were at a coffee shop talking about something, I think maybe Beyonce and Jay-Z, or I don't know. And she had a lot of insight, pop culture insight. She's just very engaging. I was like, if Blackbelt was a podcast, would you like to be a co-host? And she said, oh yeah, sure. So then it was still in my mind. And then my sister and I were talking, Katrina, and we were on the phone talking about our hopes and dreams and all this stuff. And she said, she used to work in TV news, and now she works in PR. And she was like, I'm just a producer looking for a show. And I said, oh, well, Blackbelt's gonna be a podcast now. Do you wanna help produce it? And she was like, oh yeah, sure. So the medium changed, but the message remained the same. And that was to center the perspectives of black Southerners, particularly those working to advance social change across the South. So as the birthplace of the civil rights movement, we need to tell, black Southerner stories. As I mentioned, Blackbelt Media is the parent company of Blackbelt Voices, and Blackbelt Voices is a podcast and blog that propagates the richness of black Southern culture by telling stories from and about black folks down South. So here's a quick footnote about a couple of words. Propagates is an intentional word we use because of the association of Black Belt with agriculture. The Black Belt is a region in the southern U.S., mainly in Alabama, where the soil was rich and dark and was fertile ground for growing crops. So enslaved Africans would work those fields, and then they continued to live in the area after emancipation. So the term evolved to have a double meaning. Another key word is stories. So the words we speak and write have the power to shape our culture, to transform society, and to bring about social change. And there's a theory behind all this. It's called the coordinated management of meaning. And it tells us, through our communication with others, we co-create our social worlds, which in turn shape who we are and how others see themselves. So the architects of this theory are W. Barnett Pierce and Vernon Cronin, and they state that we communicate with one another through stories lived and stories told. So the stories lived, those are the actions and the encounters and the experiences we have with others. So a story lived is like you are in this room today. That's your story lived. You're living it right now. And then the stories told that's how we make sense of the stories we've lived. So we talk about those stories we lived with others. Those are the stories told. So an example would be you go home and you tell people that you were in this auditorium today, you heard this person speak, but she was okay, but the food was really good, So that's the story you tell. So when we coordinate our stories lived with the stories told by others, we eventually begin to see where others are coming from. And it helps us walk in another person's shoes while also helping shape our own identities. So for example, if my story lived was that I grew up in the rural South, my grandparents had a dairy farm, my mom helped with the dairy cattle, we're a very rural family, we grew up in the country, but the stories told about being Southern are all about country music, voting Republican, the Confederacy, and other things associated with white Southerners. That will affect how I perceive my identity as a Southerner. So if you don't see yourself reflected in the stories being told about where you live or where you work, then that can affect your sense of belonging. So here's an experience I had shortly after I decided to tell more stories about black Southerners through Blackbelt Voices. Who's all familiar with this magazine? Yeah, I bet we all are. So and it was August 2017, and the Black Belt idea, it was still very much an idea. It was only a few months old. I think I had an active Twitter account at that point, but hadn't done much work on it. So I came across a tweet from Southern Living, which we all know they're a lifestyle brand that celebrates the best of Southern life. It was created in 1966 to highlight the beauty and culture of the growing South and is best known for its magazine and cookbooks. So its editorial content focuses on home and garden, style and beauty, and travel and food. So the tweet I saw that caught my attention said, "We want to bring these Southern traditions back, and we bet you do too." I was like, okay, yeah, let's see. And so I clicked on it, and then a lot of the slides in the article, they were harkened back to old-fashioned good manners, such as, we miss the days when people would say please and thank you, and say yes sir and yes ma'am, and no sir and no ma'am, and have proper table manners, and hold the door for others, and don't cuss in public. So, and other slides would describe the Southern hospitality that we're known for here, like smiling at strangers, Sunday suppers, hostess gifts, and welcoming new neighbors. So one could argue that, well, those traits aren't unique to the South. There's a lot of people who have these qualities. But when you looked at the accompanying photos for each slide, you would think that these traits were unique to only white people. So only one of the 23 slides I flipped through did not include an image of a white person. And that slide was a photograph of a recipe card box. Every picture with people, it was white people. So while I wasn't completely surprised with the lack of black people and other people of color, there was one slide that felt like a slap in the face. And it was like, let's bring back church hats. And church hats, that's something that, if you know anything about the black church, you know black women can wear a church hat. Like that, I mean, that's what we do. I mean, I don't wear one, but they're still around. We still wear them. And there's even a book that was written about it, which I didn't know at the time. It's called Crowns, Portraits of Black Women in Church Hats. So it was published in October of 2000 and was authored by Michael Cunningham and Craig Marbury, and Maya Angelou penned the foreword. And the book's description states, "A church hat, flamboyant as it may be, is no mere fashion accessory. It's a cherished African-American custom, one observed with boundless passion by black women of various religious denominations." So tongue-in-cheek, I had a sarcastic tweet that said, well, black people must not have been invented yet, because all the pictures were kind of old-timey pictures. So, and then I said, this is one more reason we need Black Belt Voices. So there's a quote that I love from an author named Elaine Massacre. She's the author of a book called More Than Enough, and she was the first black editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. And she says, in order to change the stories, you must change the storytellers. So Black Belt has allowed me and my team to center the perspectives of black Americans who have contributed greatly to the South's history and culture, yet we haven't been able to fully lay claim to Southern heritage. So my co-host Kara, my sister Katrina, who's a producer, and we launched the podcast in September 2019, and we've shared stories on a variety of topics. Some are very lighthearted, like the one featuring a Memphis-based interior designer who talked about how to spruce up your space with plants. My sister and my mom really took that to heart, and they have like tons of plants in their house based on the episode, and I have about 3 because of it, 3 total. And so we also had an episode about natural hair and the politics behind natural hair. There are actually laws that have been passed to stop hair discrimination, which is a real thing. People can't wear their hair in its natural state historically, so they're trying to change those things. And we talked about our own hair journeys as black women, and also we talked to a preteen about her hair to get a different generational perspective, and thankfully she was kind of like, yeah, we don't really talk about it much. Like, to them, it's not as big of a deal, so we can already see things are changing. So some topics, though, are a little tougher to talk about and deal with the history of racism in the state and in the South and throughout the country that has been kind of buried and not taught in our schools. So one time we had a professor from UA Little Rock to talk about the Elaine Massacre. That happened in Elaine, Arkansas, a little more than 100 years ago, and a group of black sharecroppers met to kind of discuss getting fair wages, and some of the other white farmers found out about it, and then someone was killed that night, and then it just, a massacre occurred after that. So 200 black men, women, and children were killed by white men who attacked the town after that incident. So it was really not discussed for many, many years, and now there's a memorial to it, and now it's getting talked about more, but it's something that has been buried in our state. And we also talked to a man named Mr. Ronnie Williams. He's from Menifee. He works at UCA, and we talked to him about the death of his brother, Marvin Williams, back in 1960. And Marvin died in police custody, and his death was ruled an accident. They said he fell and tripped down the stairs. But 25 years later, an inmate who was a white man wrote his family saying, "I have to tell the truth. I know I heard them beating your brother." And so we told that story and how all the ways that it was covered up and the trial that followed when the officers were put on trial for murder. So these are the stories we wanted to share. So we want to center Black Southerners in everything we do in regards to the podcast, because for too long, Black people across the country have been on the margins, so we're trying to put ourselves in the center with this work. So our goal in telling these stories is to honor Black history, celebrate Black Southern culture, and shape a brighter, more progressive future for the South through these stories. So there's been an appetite for these stories and this perspective. So the Blackbelt Voices podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, it's experienced some exciting initial success. It landed among the top 100 in Apple Podcasts after we were featured on the platform's Browse page back in January of 2020. We were in the new and noteworthy section, which got a lot of attention. And so in June of last year, after the murder of George Floyd led to worldwide protests and a national reckoning on race, Blackbelt Voices was again highlighted on Apple Podcasts' Browse page in several different collections that they curated to highlight Black creators. So as a result, Blackbelt Voices made an appearance in Vanity Fair in an article called 8 Podcasts to Deepen Your Knowledge of Black History. In October, the podcast was listed in Ode to Oprah magazine in a roundup titled The 15 Best Educational Podcasts for You to Expand Your Mind. So while the national attention was exciting, we've also been encouraged by listener feedback. And of course, this is our highlight reel. Not every review is glowing. We have some 1 stars and some stuff on there. It's like, okay, whatever. But we try to take things to heart. But some things, some things you listen to, and some things you just gotta let go to keep your sanity. But anyway, so here's some 5-star reviews from listeners. The one that says the South has something to say. It says, "I just sat and listened to every episode of this podcast, of this show. It's unapologetically Black and unapologetically Southern," and that's exactly what we wanted to do. So we have amassed more than 200,000 all-time downloads a year and a half after our launch, which is something we never imagined. So what's the reason behind this success? A lot of it, especially the stuff that happened in June, was about timing. But I think what caught Apple's eye and what caught some of these magazines' eye was the authenticity with which we tell these stories. And they saw that we were filling a gap that needed to be filled. So that perspective that we shared was missing from the national political conversation and also from the podcast space. So as we know, there are far more perspectives out there that need to be shared, so this is how you will unearth them in your own lives. So now that you have a little background on Black Belt and how stories can shape who we are as individuals and as institutions and as a society, here's a framework that I developed to help you think about as you tell stories. And stories are our oldest form of communication, and they're how we can change attitudes, mindsets, and behaviors. And they also help us practice empathy by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. So this 3-step process is called Discover, Refine, and Amplify. That helps you unleash the power of stories. And as we go through these next few slides, just think about a time when you wanted something to change, whether it's in your workplace or in your own life or in an organization you're part of, like a church, and then think about how you can use stories to get there. So the first step is to discover. This is when you find out what stories are not being told, and then you tell them. And when I say tell them, you think about who may be the best person to uncover and tell those stories. And you want to cultivate a culture of curiosity. So there's a 2018 article that appeared in Harvard Business Review by Francesca Gino, and she outlines the business case for curiosity. She says that maintaining a sense of wonder is crucial to creativity and innovation and makes us less likely to fall prey to confirmation bias, which is when you look for information that supports your beliefs rather than looking for evidence suggesting that you may be wrong. And then to stereotyping people, which is making broad judgments such as women or people of color don't make good leaders. So Gino also argues that to encourage curiosity, leaders should teach those in organizations whether it's a workplace or a church or even a family, how to ask good questions. So we learn from an early age that questions are what help us understand the world. And if you've ever been around a small child, any length of time, you know that they love to ask why. So my toddler is not there yet. His favorite word is still no. So we have a little longer. But we're born with this curiosity, and so we can tap into it in order to tell better stories. So when it comes to uncovering untold stories, there are a few questions you can ask to make sure you're getting the most diverse perspectives. So where are the gaps? Whose voice is missing from this conversation? What stories are not being told? Who is the best person to tell these stories? And there's a book by Brittany Cooper called Eloquent Rage, a Black feminist discovers her superpower. And she talks about curiosity in her book and the importance of asking questions to find effective solutions. She says, curiosity is often the first casualty of the politics of fear. Sometimes the things we fear most are our questions. More specifically, we fear the questions to which we don't have answers. When we are afraid, we stop asking questions and start seeking short-term solutions. So once we tap into our innate curiosity and have a better idea of the stories that are out there, we can start listening to the stories that are being told. And listening can take many different forms. You can listen informally by just paying attention. You can pay attention to what's being said and also what's not being said. Or you can take a more formal approach if you're in a workplace like that, an organization, and conduct a survey or a focus group to find out what's on people's minds and what they really want to talk about. And so if you come into the conversation with curiosity and a desire to connect, you can learn more from people, and you also need to be aware of your unconscious biases that you may have. And in this phase, the discover phase, this is where you'd involve the most people to get a variety of perspectives and identify any blind spots. So don't be afraid to jot down notes when the person is talking so you can remember what they said later, because note-taking will come in handy in the next phase, which is refine. So during this stage, you take the information you received from the discover phase, and then you use it to look for themes to fine-tune your message. So you find some common ideas, some words and phrases that keep popping up, and that will help you kind of figure out, okay, what are the themes here? What are people trying to say? So this stage can involve a smaller number of people, like if you had a special committee or an affinity group or something like that, of people with different perspectives who can really drill down to what folks are telling you. So in this stage, you can truly begin to see what problem needs to be solved. And you can then craft SMART goals to help solve this problem. And SMART goals, as you may have heard, it stands for goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Because when you write your goals in this way, whether it's trying to change an organization or lose a few pounds, it helps you know where you want to go and how you plan to get there. And so a lot of times it's tempting for organizations to jump right to this stage, jump right to the goals without doing that initial discover work. Like they're just basing it on their own ideas, but not getting out there to see what other people are saying. So when we listen first, we ensure that we get a variety of perspectives and we don't operate in silos. And it's in this refine phase where we can drill down to how to use stories to create change. And the final step is to amplify. And this is the fun part. This is the part that you think about when you think of communication. So this stage will probably involve your communications team or just a few people to craft the messages, but anyone can share these messages on their platforms. So before you jump into the platform, think about what's the best way to share these stories. And that's kind of like I had an idea that I wanted to do a blog because I like to write, but then I realized, well, the best way is probably audio because that's where we get the most emotion. So oftentimes we start with a platform first. Like you may hear people say, oh, we need a TikTok account, or we need to blog, or we need a podcast, or we need to be on Clubhouse, or we need to, be on, well, is Snapchat still around? It is, but, Anyway, you think about the platform first. But once you have an idea of the stories you want to share and the people you want to reach,